Hello, historians. Welcome back to Cocktails and Cliff Notes. I'm your host, Mason, and I just have a quick question for you today. Do you ever feel like the government was taxing you unfairly or that your voice wasn't being heard? Now, if you just imagine for a minute that particular frustration boiling over into an act of rebellion, and this would be at the time of George Washington, and imagine that he had to actually lead his troops directly into battle, and this is after the revolution was fought and won. Now, this is not ancient history. I'm not making this up. This is the Whiskey Rebellion. And this story offers quite a few very uncanny parallels between today's debates about freedom, government, overreach, and the power of the people. And it turns out the same things were going on back then, too. So let's just go ahead and jump into this. We're going to uncork the forgotten story that still resonates today. But before we do that, we're going to make a quick drink. If you want to skip that, go ahead and use the timestamps below. And if you like stuff like this, if you like history, I post every Tuesday and Thursday. And if you're a fan of history or you just like to know about things for the sake of knowing about things, much like myself, this might be a good place for you to hang out. In the meantime, let's make a quick drink, or you can skip it, whatever you want to do. Let's just keep going. So, the weather outside is very frightful, and I wish it was Christmas time. Unfortunately, it's not. Anyway, the only reason that I'm bringing that up is because I don't really like to drive in the icy, snowy, bad weather. And so, I am going to have to just do a couple episodes where I gather things from my house. And luckily, my dad had brought over a fresh case of brew, and so we're just gonna have a beer today. And I do have whiskey in this home, but I hate whiskey, you guys. I'm so sorry to say that. I just can't stand it. I give it a try every couple months, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'll find something about it that I like, and I never do. So I could have suffered through a whiskey-based cocktail today, and I refused to do it. I thought, let's just have a beer. So I will say, my dad had these cool little thingies made. And so we're just going to do this. I feel like it makes it a little bit fancier. Maybe I'm wrong. These are great little lake things, though. I also feel like I never really get to use these. I rarely actually take them to the lake because I lose stuff at the lake. But isn't that great? It's nice. It's got his little logo on there. I love it. But that's it. That's all we're doing. It's cold. There's probably gonna be like the next 3 or 4 things that I put out are gonna be me being like, well, I have some wine at my house or something because I can't really run to the store. I probably could, but I just don't want to. Okay. Now that we have our drinks, we can really talk. Now, I'm going to tell you today is going to be kind of a quick one. This was a very quick point in history. It kind of rose and fell very fast, but we'll just go ahead and get into it. So, this is before 1791, and whiskey at the time was not a vice on the frontier. It was actually some very frequently used infrastructure. At this time, we're coming off of the heels of the revolution. Things are just a little bit touch and go, and grain was very heavy. Roads were absolutely terrible, and cash itself, or cold hard cash money, it was scarce. It was not just in abundance, and people didn't use that exclusively at the time. Turning surplus corn into rye and rye into whiskey made a lot of economic sense. People were going to trade for a little something warm going down your throat. It held its value, it traveled very well, it was used to pay off people's debts, it was paid to pay people's wages, people could pay for medical professional help, medical attention. You pay your doctor with a little bottle of whiskey. I mean, honestly, I love it, and I also love the idea of my doctor being a little buzzed when he's working on me. But I'm basically just getting at the point that in some places, whiskey was actually functioning as liquid currency in every sense of the word, not just metaphor. They were literally using it to pay for things, and it probably, in a lot of cases, was more valuable than money. They were gonna spend it on whiskey anyway. Now, moonshining, this was not a criminal act. It was actually very practical. It was a skill that people admired and wanted to learn. And at this time, it was also very deeply personal. Now, I want to introduce you to a man named Hamilton. And I'm sure you've heard of good old Hamilton before. So, Alexander Hamilton, he just saunters in. He is not armed with a musket. He is more so armed with a vision, and he's got big ideas, right? I don't know if you've heard the story of Hamilton in some form or fashion, but he was a dreamer. He had a big plan. Now, the United States at this time was drowning in debt that was still left over from the Revolutionary War. Now, Hamilton, he really thought that the only way to survive this particular chunk of history was to prove that the federal government could do what the old Confederation never could. And they thought, we're going to need to tax, we're going to need to collect, we're going to need to enforce. And while we obviously just fought a major war over these particular principles, it'll be different this time because it's us taxing our own people. And, it's not coming from this, cold, distant empire. So in 1791, Congress actually passed a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. Now, this was the very first of its kind. So, on paper, it was very, very modest, but in practice, it landed the hardest on small frontier distillers who paid by volume, not profit. So to them, they're like, this feels eerily familiar, and we don't particularly like what's going on. It really did not actually seem all that different because they're out there, they're, cooking up their whiskey in the middle of the woods. And it still felt like these distant lawmakers, even though they weren't across the pond, they were still very, very far away. And now they're imposing these rules without understanding on the margins and how people were actually using whiskey on a day to day basis. And so it felt like they were crossing some lines that they had all just come together to basically defend. And at the end of the day, it wasn't necessarily about the whiskey or the alcohol itself. It was more so about the power and the powers that be, which is understandable. And at the end of the day, could the government really reach into these remote valleys and demand compliance? Could it actually enforce law beyond their coastal cities and the very small group of colonies that they had set up? And did independence mean freedom from all centralized authority or just British authority? So these are things that people are kicking around over a nice old fashioned or something like that. Now, frontier settlers, they had just fought a war against taxation enforced by outsiders. Now, the outsiders wore these American coats and called themselves citizens of the United States. So, refusal to pay was actually going to turn into protests. Now, these protests hardened into direct defiance, and tax collectors were actually threatened. They were tarred, possibly even feathered, and they were chased out of counties. Liberty poles went right up, and federal authority was missing. Suddenly, the United States was facing a question that it absolutely could not dodge. Was this a nation, or was this more of a suggestion? Now, we're just going to go ahead and follow the whiskey from the stills of Western Pennsylvania all the way to the halls of federal power and watch as this young republic decides whether it has the spine to survive its own principles. Because it's really easy to get mad about people telling you what you can and can't do. And when you become the person that gets to tell people what they can and can't do, suddenly those requests don't seem so outlandish now, do they? Now, this little whiskey rebellion, this is not necessarily just a little footnote, though I don't think it's taught very often. I certainly didn't know about it until I just started reading everything that I could about this point in history. This was actually more so a moment for America. It was the time when young colonies, Americans, this new country actually found out whether it believed in itself and whether or not it believed in the cause that it stood up so bravely for. Could this young republic even survive an open insurrection? Now, that was the question hanging in the air. And by 1974, it was not whispered in taverns, it was debated in the highest offices of government. Washington, he actually faced a choice that no president had ever faced before, which was pretty easy to do because he was the first president. So, he faced a choice that most humans didn't have to face. But everything he did was the first time a president did anything. But I'm just saying that the Constitution really couldn't fully answer some of these more day to day scenarios and real time decisions that needed to be made. You had these really big, broad, beautiful painted pictures of what they thought that the country could stand for and all these ideals and these freedoms and these wonderful things written in. But then once you kind of get into the nitty gritty, it becomes a little bit harder to decide on a case by case basis, what's fitting here? Are we stepping on freedoms? But that doesn't work. How does this actually play out in real time when you're dealing with real people trying to live real lives? What does it actually look like? God, it's hard to know. They've really just been kind of making things up as they go along, and they've been doing a pretty good job of it. But this is one of those where everybody's like, hold on, what do we actually do? We don't know. We don't know. What do we do? Everybody's looking at each other like, got any ideas? Because most of the ideas that I have are stepping on the direct freedoms that we're trying to protect. What do you got? And nobody knows. Really, at the end of the day, it was like, do we want to compromise or do we want to be more authoritarian and, enforce things that make sense to us? But yeesh, we don't want to be what we hate. So everybody's just stressed out. These are like real things that had to be straightened out. And, you know, you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't in some cases. Now, the thing that was being thrown around was that if George, good old George, were to back down, would it send a very clear message that federal law really only mattered when it was convenient, and the whiskey tax, it would very quickly become an optional thing, and who's going to opt to pay taxes if they don't have to? Then there would be tariffs and then treaties, and then the republic itself would begin to kind of fray at the edges, and it was just kind of like this doom spiral of like, if we do nothing, we're screwed. But if old George were to act, and I mean really act, he risked becoming the one thing that Americans claimed to hate, including himself. And he led the overthrowing of principles like these, do what I say or there's trouble. Now, he was the distant ruler. He was the one that was actually using force to actually compel obedience. And he's like, I don't know if I should do that. And luckily, Washington was not known to be overly impulsive. So he's sitting there, he's talking it out with people, and he's really trying to figure out what the best move is. And eventually, he actually came to a decision. George Washington chose action. Now, what came next was a bit unprecedented or unprecedented because, once again, he was the first president. So everything he did was like, whoa, this is the first for everything. How exciting for him. Now, I will tell you right now, he did not send off a letter. He did not dispatch a single regiment. He actually called up nearly 13,000 militia from every single state. Now, I want you to let that sink in. It's like he's going back to the heart of the revolution. I mean, he's like, everybody, I need you here with me now from every single colony or states. They were states at this point. From every single state, give me as many as you can give me. 13,000 people. Think about that. That's crazy. He's wild. This particular force was actually now larger than the army that won independence, larger than the army that froze their little booties off at Valley Forge. This was larger than the one that he crossed the Delaware with. And this time, it wasn't marching against redcoats, it was actually marching against Americans, against its own people, which was like a new color they were trying on. It was like weird and different, and it felt odd to do. Everybody was like, Lee, we don't know about this. We don't know about this. This is a bit weird. This wasn't just a military operation. This was more of a statement, and it was being written in boots and bayonets. And the federal government was not an idea anymore. It was a real thing. It had weight, it had mass and matter, and it had reach. And it could walk into the frontier openly, marching in unison. They could walk out there with order and be seen by the public. And it was a really big deal. Now, he's gathered all these people, and Washington decides that he's going to do something a little bit crazy. And he is actually going to climb on his horse and he's going to go with these guys, which again was super odd for somebody in his position at his level of power to be like, I'll just tag along. Let's go handle this situation. We're going to handle this scandal. George is coming. I do want you to kind of think through the scenario, though, a little bit because it's kind of shocking. Like the idea of it itself was sending shockwaves through the country because the sitting president of this newly formed United States, a man who could have easily stayed safe and cozy sitting behind his desk, is now riding at the head of an army that's technically aimed at its own people. There were no kings that had done this. No president was ever going to do this again. So he was the first and last to do something so crazy. But for some, it was a very terrifying thing. It was a very odd idea. But for others, it was very, very reassuring. They kind of liked it. However, for every person, it was very unforgettable. Now, there's not a huge climax in this story because what ended up happening is the Whiskey Rebellion actually collapsed before there was ever even a major battle that got fought, which is a good thing. They basically just took care of it. Now, this little rebellion was being faced with an overwhelming force. There were not enough little whiskey brewers to gather together, so the rebellion fizzled. But the legacy and the stress and the tension behind it never totally cooled. Now, there were some arrests, there were a few trials, there were major headlines, and these headlines were sent out and read way beyond Western Pennsylvania. There were two men who were actually convicted of treason, which was crazy because during this time, every single revolutionary generation, they swore up and down that they were never going to see treason, not on their soil ever again. This is where George just continues to surprise us. And his final move in this entire situation is he actually went in and he pardoned everyone involved in this rebellion. Now, this was not a weak move, not at all. This was more of a tactic, which George was full of. He was so smart, you guys. He was so sharp with stuff like this. Now, he wanted to do this because there was a message that needed to be sent, but it didn't necessarily need to be as severe as some people might have thought. Now, the message that he was going for, it was very layered, it was multi-layered, and it was very, very deliberate. Now, the idea was that the federal government, they could reach you, they could judge you, they could punish you, but most of all, the federal government could also choose mercy. Now, authority didn't need bloodshed to be real. What emerged from this little whiskey rebellion was a line that was drawn in clear and unmistakable ink. You can argue, you are more than welcome to protest, you can shout, you can petition, and you can vote. But armed resistance to federal law, that's a closed door. You can't be doing that. We believe in freedom, but I guess not overthrowing the government just because you want to make whiskey and not be taxed on it. Now, for the first time, what Americans were seeing from this little situation was what the Constitution actually was. It wasn't this hopeful little blueprint. It was not a philosophical pamphlet. It was no longer just a discussion. It was a well working machine. It could raise money. It could mobilize force if need be. It could compel obedience without becoming tyrannical, which is everything that they had worked for. Now, this Whiskey Rebellion, it was a very brief point in history. It was, as I said earlier, it was very anticlimactic, but it did sculpt the contours of American power in a way that victories on the battlefield never really did. It proved that the Republic wasn't necessarily this fragile parchment waiting to tear. It actually had teeth. It had a plan, and above all, it had very strong leadership. And maybe, just maybe, that is a very uncomfortable lesson. Freedom did not survive because the government stayed weak or because they didn't have people that were willing to fight for the things that they believed in. It survived because the government could prove to outside entities and on their home turf that it could be very strong. And then it also showed that it could turn around and choose restraint. And this is why I feel that this story should have just a little bit of attention where I had no idea that it existed. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who have maybe never heard of the Whiskey Rebellion. But really, I think it's safe to say that the arguments that flared up in the Whiskey Rebellion never really went away. They've just changed costumes over the years because federal power versus state authority, individual liberty versus collective security, how much control is necessary and how much control is a bit too much. These are questions we've been wrestling around with from the beginning and the birth of this nation. We still wrestle with these questions. We just argue into microphones more often than we do with muskets and bayonets. Lord willing, let's keep it that way. Use your voice, use your voices, use your voice. Now, I will say that this so called forgotten fight matters because it's never just about whiskey, it's never just about taxes or a few angry distillers. Few angry whiskey cooks out on the frontier. That's not what this is about. This is very much about the soul of the Republic and who, in the end, holds the reins of power. Is it a distant government? Or is it local communities? Or maybe it's some uneasy balance that constantly, and I mean constantly, needs renegotiation? And the Whiskey Rebellion, as I see it, did nothing to actually settle the debate. It did define it, though, just a little bit. So, the next time that you go to pour yourself a little dram, pause for just a minute because you are not just holding a drink. You are actually holding a reminder that America has always been a negotiation between authority and freedom and order and defiance. And that argument, like good whiskey, is still aging. And honestly, I don't care for whiskey at all. But I will tell you right here, right now, that I do think that this is worth talking about. And if you like chatting about stuff like this and other points in history, please feel free to like and subscribe and follow along because I will be back with more little blips in history, some we know oh so well, and some that we have easily forgotten. But in the meantime, cheers to the rebellion that taught a nation who it was and who it is still trying to be. I will see you in the next one.